How did a single decree from 1823 carve out an entire hemisphere as one nation's domain? The power move that redefined the world. To understand the Monroe Doctrine, we have to travel back to the early 1820s. The Napoleonic Wars have just ended, and the old monarchies of Europe are trying to turn back the clock, forming a holy alliance to crush the very idea of revolution. At the same time, across the Atlantic, a wave of independence has swept through Latin America, with new republics emerging from the ashes of the Spanish and Portuguese empires. But these new nations were fragile, and the European powers saw an opportunity to reclaim their lost colonies. What could the young and militarily weak United States possibly do to stop the combined might of European empires? The answer, it seemed, came from an unexpected source: Great Britain. London had no desire to see its rivals, Spain and France, regain a foothold in the Americas, which would threaten Britain's lucrative trade routes. So, the British Foreign Secretary, George Canning, made a proposal to Washington, a joint declaration warning the rest of Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. On the surface, it was a golden opportunity, an alliance with the world's undisputed naval superpower. So why did the United States, in a stunning move, decide to reject Britain's offer and go it alone? The answer lies in the strategic mind of one man, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. While others in President James Monroe's cabinet were tempted by the British offer, Adams was deeply suspicious. He argued that a joint declaration would make the United States look like a subordinate, a cock boat in the wake of the British man of war, as he famously put it. Adams envisioned something far grander, a unilateral American statement that would not only protect the new Latin American republics, but also establish the United States as the dominant power in its own hemisphere. It was an incredibly audacious gamble. A declaration without a powerful navy to enforce it could have been laughed off as an empty threat. So how did the world react when the Americans made their move? On December 2nd, 1823, President James Monroe did not sign a treaty or issue a grand proclamation. Instead, he embedded his new foreign policy within his annual address to the United States Congress. The message, which would later be known as the Monroe Doctrine, had two fundamental points. First, non-colonization. The American continents, he declared, were no longer open to colonization by any European power. Second, non-intervention. Any attempt by a European nation to impose its political system on any state in the Western Hemisphere would be seen as an act of hostility against the United States itself. But this was a two-way street. In return, the United States pledged to stay out of European affairs. This single statement laid claim to an entire hemisphere. But did anyone in the powerful courts of Europe actually take it seriously? Initially, not really. The monarchies of Europe were dismissive, fully aware that the United States lacked the military force to back up its bold words. The true enforcer of the doctrine in its early years was, ironically, the very power the United States had refused to partner with, the British Royal Navy, which protected its own interests by keeping other Europeans out of the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine was not a statement of present reality, but a profound declaration of future ambition. It was a cornerstone, a document that would be reinterpreted, expanded, and used in ways its creators could never have imagined. But this was only the beginning of its long and controversial history. How would this doctrine evolve from a defensive warning into a justification for American intervention, shaping the destiny of nations from Mexico to Argentina for the next 200 years. One wrong move, that's all it would take. How did early America not collapse? The year is 1823. The United States of America is less than 50 years old, a fragile republic in a world dominated by powerful empires. To the north, the vast expanse of British Canada. To the south and west, the crumbling but still dangerous remnants of the Spanish Empire. And across the Atlantic Ocean, the great monarchies of Europe are watching, and they are waiting. At this very moment, a fire of revolution is sweeping through Latin America, shattering 3 centuries of colonial rule. New nations from Mexico down to Argentina are being born in blood and fire, fighting for their very survival. But these fledgling republics were weak, and the old powers of Europe had a plan to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. What was this plan, and how did it threaten to undo everything the American revolutions had fought for? After the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte, the conservative monarchies of Europe, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and a restored France, formed a powerful coalition. First known as the Holy Alliance, its goal was simple and brutal: to crush revolution wherever it appeared and restore what they called legitimate monarchs to their thrones. They had already intervened in Spain and Italy, successfully stamping out liberal uprisings with force. And now their gaze was turning westward across the Atlantic. The question on every diplomat's lips was not if they would intervene in the former Spanish colonies, but when. What could the young, isolated United States possibly do to stop them? But there was another player on the board, one with a very different agenda: Great Britain. Britain had also fought Napoleon, but its interests were not in restoring absolute monarchy. Their interests were in something far more practical: trade. The newly independent Latin American nations had thrown open their ports to British merchants, creating a booming and incredibly profitable new market. A Spanish or French reconquest would slam that door shut, and the British Empire could not allow that to happen. So, the British Foreign Secretary, George Canning, made a stunning proposal to the American minister in London. He suggested that Great Britain and the United States issue a joint declaration warning the other European powers against any intervention in the Americas. On the surface, it seemed like a golden opportunity for the United States. But why did Secretary of State John Quincy Adams believe it was a trap? In Washington, District of Columbia, President James Monroe's cabinet was deeply divided. Accepting the British offer seemed like the safe, logical move. The Royal Navy, the most powerful military force on the planet, would act as the enforcer, protecting American interests at no cost to the Americans themselves. But John Quincy Adams, the brilliant and fiercely nationalistic Secretary of State, saw the hidden danger. He argued that a joint declaration would make the United States look like a junior partner, a cock boat in the wake of the British man of war. As he famously put it, he believed it would forever tie American hands, positioning Britain as the true power in the Western Hemisphere. So Adams proposed a radical, almost reckless alternative. The United States should make its own declaration, alone. How could a nation with a tiny navy and a small army dare to defy the combined might of continental Europe? President Monroe was ultimately persuaded by Adams's audacious vision. He chose to gamble, to act unilaterally. On December 2nd, 1823, Monroe delivered his annual message to Congress. Buried within this otherwise routine address was a statement that would echo through the centuries. He declared that the American continents were, quote, henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. He went further, stating that the United States would view any attempt by those powers to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as, quote, dangerous to our peace and safety. It was an incredibly bold statement of principle, but were these just empty words? What power did this declaration, which would later become known as the Monroe Doctrine, actually have? The truth is, in 1823, the doctrine was mostly a bluff. The United States did not possess the military might to enforce it against the navies of Europe. So why did it work? It worked because everyone, including the Holy Alliance, knew that the American policy was quietly, implicitly backed by the one power that could enforce it, the British Royal Navy. Britain's own self-interest in protecting its trade routes aligned perfectly, for that moment, with American policy. John Quincy Adams had played a masterful game of geopolitical chess. He used the British offer as leverage, then rejected it to assert American independence, all while knowing that British naval power would still shield the Americas from intervention. It was a declaration of principle that would grow with the nation's power, shaping American foreign policy for over a century and defining the relationship, for better and for worse, between the United States and its neighbors to the south. It was a gamble born from a position of weakness that ultimately projected an image of strength, forever changing the destiny of the Western Hemisphere. Everyone talks about American exceptionalism, but this moment in 1823, that's when it truly began. Why? In the year 1823, the fifth President of the United States, James Monroe, delivered what seemed like a routine annual message to Congress. But buried within that speech was a declaration so audacious, so bold, that it would echo through the centuries and fundamentally reshape the Western Hemisphere. What was this message, and why did it send shockwaves across the capitals of Europe? To understand the gravity of Monroe's words, we have to travel back to the world of the early 19th century. Europe was emerging from the ashes of the Napoleonic Wars, a conflict that had redrawn maps and toppled empires. In the aftermath, a coalition of conservative monarchies, known as the Holy Alliance, sought to restore the old order, crushing republicanism and liberalism wherever it appeared. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a wave of revolution was sweeping through Latin America. From Mexico to Argentina, colonies were breaking free from Spanish and Portuguese rule, establishing new, fragile republics. The old powers of Europe, however, saw these new nations not as sovereign states, but as lost territories to be reclaimed, possibly by force. This set the stage for a monumental confrontation, but the United States was still a young, relatively weak nation. How could it possibly stand up to the combined might of Europe? The answer, surprisingly, involves the United States' old adversary, Great Britain. While the continental powers plotted to restore Spanish authority, Britain had a different interest. They were profiting immensely from trade with the newly independent Latin American nations, trade that would be cut off if Spain regained control. So, the British Foreign Secretary, George Canning, made a secret proposal to the American government, a joint declaration, warning the other European powers to stay out of the Americas. This was a tempting offer. An alliance with the world's greatest naval power would guarantee the security of the hemisphere. But for one key figure in Monroe's cabinet, this proposal was a trap. Who was this man, and what did he see that others did not? That man was Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, a brilliant and fiercely nationalistic diplomat. He argued powerfully against the Joint Declaration, seeing it as a junior partnership that would make the United States look like, in his words, a cockboat in the wake of the British man-of-war. Adams believed that the United States must issue its own unilateral statement. It was a massive gamble. He reasoned that Great Britain, driven by its own self-interest, would enforce the policy with its navy anyway, whether the United States joined them or not. By acting alone, the United States could claim the role of protector of the hemisphere, establishing a principle that the New World and the Old World were fundamentally different political and diplomatic spheres. But would President Monroe listen to his ambitious Secretary of State, or would he choose the safer path of a British alliance? In the end, Monroe was persuaded by Adams' vision. On December 2, 1823, he delivered his 7th annual message to Congress. He did not call it the Monroe Doctrine. That name would come decades later. He simply laid out the policy. The message had two main components. First, it declared that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. Second, it stated that the United States would view any attempt by European powers to extend their political system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. In 1823, the declaration was, in many ways, a bluff. The United States lacked the military power to actually enforce it. It was the British Royal Navy that truly kept the other European powers at bay. But the long-term significance was not in its immediate military power, but in the powerful idea it planted. The Monroe Doctrine was a turning point. It was the first major American foreign policy statement that looked beyond its own borders, defining an entire hemisphere as its sphere of influence. It was a declaration of intent, a statement of ambition that would shape American actions for the next 2 centuries. It laid the ideological groundwork for everything from the annexation of Texas to the Panama Canal, and even the Cold War confrontations in Cuba. So when we talk about American exceptionalism, we must look back to this moment, not as a display of power the United States already had, but as a bold claim to the power it intended to acquire. A young nation, drawing a line in the sand and telling the old empires of the world, this half of the planet is ours. We celebrate the Monroe Doctrine as a cornerstone of American defiance, a moment when the young United States told the old powers of Europe that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open for colonization. But what if that legendary defiance was not a show of strength, but a brilliant, calculated gamble on someone else's power? The year was 1823. The Napoleonic Wars had shattered the old European order, and across Latin America, former Spanish colonies had fought and won their independence. In Washington, President James Monroe and his administration watched with a mixture of ideological sympathy and strategic concern. But a dark cloud was forming over Europe. The conservative monarchies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, united in the so-called Holy Alliance, were openly discussing plans to help Spain reconquer its lost empire. This presented a direct threat to the United States' vision of a hemisphere of independent republics. The question was, what could they actually do about it? At that time, the United States was a regional power at best. Its army was small, and its navy, while proud, was utterly dwarfed by the fleets of Europe. A direct military confrontation with a coalition of European empires was not just unwinnable, it was unthinkable. And yet, on December 2nd, 1823, Monroe delivered his annual message to Congress containing the audacious words that would become his doctrine. How could a nation with so little military might make such a grand and provocative declaration? The secret lies not in Washington, but across the Atlantic, in London. Great Britain, the world's foremost naval and commercial power, had no love for the reactionary politics of the Holy Alliance. More importantly, British merchants had established incredibly profitable trade relationships with the newly independent Latin American nations. The restoration of Spanish colonial rule, with its restrictive mercantile policies, would have been a disaster for the British economy. They had a powerful vested interest in keeping other European powers out. Recognizing this shared interest, British Foreign Secretary George Canning actually proposed that Great Britain and the United States issue a joint declaration. But here, the story takes a fascinating turn, thanks to one man, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. Adams was deeply suspicious of British motives. He argued powerfully within Monroe's cabinet that a joint declaration would make the United States appear as a cock boat in the wake of the British man of war. He believed it was essential for American prestige and future influence to make a unilateral statement. It was a risky, almost arrogant proposition. So why did Monroe and his cabinet agree to it? Because Adams had perceived a fundamental geopolitical truth. He calculated that Great Britain's own self-interest would compel the Royal Navy to enforce the very policy the United States was declaring, whether they had a formal agreement or not. Britain would never allow France or Russia to intervene in the Americas because it would threaten British naval supremacy and commerce. So the United States got to issue its bold, independent doctrine, secure in the quiet knowledge that the world's most powerful navy was, for its own reasons, acting as its silent, unwilling enforcer. The Monroe Doctrine was, in its inception, one of the most successful bluffs in diplomatic history. It was a declaration of principle that the United States could not back up, made possible only by relying on the strength of a rival. Over the next century, as American power grew, the doctrine would transform. But its origin lies in this moment of profound insight, a recognition that in the great game of nations, sometimes the boldest statement you can make is the one you know someone else will be forced to defend. Before the World Wars, a bold assertion declared America's place. The Roosevelt corollary was not just policy, it was an empire's charter. To understand this radical shift, we must first travel back to 1823. President James Monroe declared the Americas off-limits to further European colonization. This, the Monroe Doctrine, was a line in the sand, a defensive posture from a young nation. But what happens when that nation is no longer young and no longer content with just being on the defensive? Fast forward to 1902. Venezuela, deep in debt, found its ports blockaded by warships from Great Britain, Germany, and Italy, all demanding payment. This was a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. Yet, President Theodore Roosevelt saw this not just as a crisis, but as a profound opportunity to redefine America's role in the world. He believed that if European powers could intervene over finances, they might eventually reestablish a permanent presence. This was unacceptable. But his solution would prove to be far more controversial than the problem it aimed to solve. In his annual message to Congress in December of 1904, Roosevelt laid out his new vision. He argued that chronic wrongdoing, or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, might force the United States, however reluctantly, to exercise an international police power. It was a stunning declaration. The United States would not just forbid European intervention, it would take on the role of intervener itself. The ink was barely dry when the first test arrived. In 1905, the Dominican Republic was on the verge of bankruptcy, owing vast sums to European banks. Instead of allowing Europe to collect, the United States stepped in. American agents took control of the nation's customs houses, collecting tariffs and distributing the revenue to pay off the debts. On the surface, it seemed like responsible management. But what did it mean for the sovereignty of the Dominican Republic? This was not an isolated incident. It became the blueprint for a new era of American foreign policy, often called dollar diplomacy. This policy saw the United States repeatedly intervene in the affairs of Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and other nations across Central America and the Caribbean. The big stick was no longer just a threat. It was being actively used to protect and expand American economic and strategic interests. The question was, where would it end? Throughout Latin America, the Roosevelt corollary was not seen as a protective shield. It was viewed as an arrogant and aggressive justification for American imperialism. The policeman of the Hemisphere was seen more as a bully, creating a deep well of resentment and mistrust that would poison relationships for decades to come. This policy solidified the image of Yankee imperialism in the minds of millions. This era of interventionism could not last forever. The immense financial cost and the growing political backlash eventually led to a reevaluation. By the 1930s, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt announced a dramatic reversal with his good neighbor policy, formally renouncing the right of armed intervention. But could a simple declaration erase the memory of decades of military occupations and political manipulation? The Roosevelt corollary represents a pivotal moment in American history. It transformed the defensive Monroe Doctrine into an offensive charter for intervention. It asserted the United States as the undisputed hegemon of the Western Hemisphere, but at a tremendous cost to its relationships with its southern neighbors. The legacy of the corollary is a complex tapestry of power, paternalism, and resistance, a story whose echoes continue to shape the politics of the Americas even today. Forget what you learned in history class. The big stick wasn't just a phrase, it was a wound that never healed for an entire continent. The story begins with a familiar proverb famously adopted by President Theodore Roosevelt. Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far. For many Americans, it symbolized a new era of national confidence. But for the nations of Latin America, it heralded something far more ominous. What did that big stick actually look like when it was swung? To understand its impact, we must first look back to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. Originally, it was a warning to European powers to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. But in 1904, Roosevelt radically rewrote the rules with his corollary. He declared that the United States had the right and the duty to act as an international police power in the region. This single declaration would change the course of history for millions. But what does it mean for one nation to police all the others? The first and perhaps most famous test case came a year earlier, in 1903, in Panama. The United States, driven by commercial and military ambition, desperately wanted to build a canal through the isthmus. The government of Colombia, which controlled the territory, refused the American terms. So, Roosevelt's administration chose another path. It actively encouraged and supported a Panamanian independence movement. It was not just quiet support. The warship USS Nashville was dispatched to physically block Colombian troops from putting down the rebellion. In a matter of days, the new nation of Panama was born, and the United States secured the rights to its canal zone. A strategic victory for Washington, but it established a dangerous precedent. This pattern of intervention, however, was just getting started. 3 years later, in 1906, the United States invoked the Platt Amendment, a law that gave it the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, to begin a second 3-year-long military occupation of the island. It was justified as an effort to stabilize the young republic, but many Cubans saw it as a continuation of colonial control under a different flag. The justification of stabilization would become a common theme, especially when money was involved. Look at the Dominican Republic. By 1904, the nation was deep in debt to European creditors, raising fears in Washington that a European power might use the debt as a pretext to establish a military presence in the Caribbean. Roosevelt's big stick solution was not to help the Dominican Republic negotiate, but to take over. United States agents seized control of the nation's customs houses, the primary source of government income. They would collect the tariffs themselves, using the money to pay off foreign debts. In effect, the United States took control of the entire Dominican economy to keep Europe out. It was a complete erosion of national sovereignty, all done in the name of order. But did these actions create stability or just a new kind of dependency? This policy evolved into what became known as dollar diplomacy under Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft. The idea was to substitute dollars for bullets, encouraging American banks and corporations to invest heavily in Latin America. The goal was the same, to bind the region's economies to the United States. This gave rise to powerful American corporations like the infamous United Fruit Company, which wielded so much influence they could make or break governments, creating the original banana republics. This economic control was often enforced by propping up authoritarian leaders, dictators who were friendly to American business interests, even if they were brutal to their own people. How could the United States champion democracy at home while supporting tyranny abroad? This question fueled a deep and lasting resentment. This legacy of intervention created a profound sense of mistrust that echoed for decades. When the Central Intelligence Agency helped overthrow the democratically elected government of Guatemala in 1954, or supported the coup in Chile in 1973, it wasn't seen in a vacuum. To many Latin Americans, it was simply the big stick doctrine, dressed in the new clothes of the Cold War. The wound wasn't just about military occupation or economic control. It was about a fundamental denial of sovereignty, the feeling of being treated as a subordinate backyard rather than as a community of equal nations. So when we analyze modern relations between the United States and its southern neighbors, Is it even possible to understand the tensions without first acknowledging this century-old wound? The big stick policy achieved its short-term goals. It secured the Panama Canal, expanded American economic influence, and kept European rivals at bay. But the long-term cost was the trust and goodwill of an entire continent. The shadow of that stick is long, and understanding its reach is the key to understanding the story of the Americas, then and now. Everywhere, resentment simmered against the United States. For decades, the policy had been one of guns and dollars, of military interventions and economic dominance. Then, Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to stop being the bad guy. But was his good neighbor policy a true moral reckoning, or was it the ultimate long game? To understand the dramatic shift, we must first look back at the world that created it. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States wasn't seen as a neighbor in Latin America. It was seen as an enforcer. Under the guise of the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, Washington claimed the right to act as an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. This wasn't just a theoretical threat. United States Marines landed in Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, often staying for years, propping up friendly governments and protecting American business interests. This was the era of big stick diplomacy, and the resentment it created was deep and lasting. But why, after all that time, would the United States suddenly choose to change course? By the 1930s, two powerful forces were converging to make the old way of doing things untenable. The first was economic. The Great Depression had devastated the American economy, and the cost of continuous military occupations was becoming a heavy burden. The United States desperately needed to open up new markets and foster stable trading partners, not create more instability. But an even greater shadow was looming on the horizon. Across the Atlantic, fascism was on the rise in Italy and Germany, and Imperial Japan was expanding in Asia. United States strategists began to realize a hard truth. In a world tilting toward a massive conflict, a hostile and resentful hemisphere was a profound strategic liability. It was in this tense and uncertain climate that Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in 1933. In his inaugural address, he made a declaration that would echo across the continents. In the field of world policy, he said, I would dedicate this nation to the policy of the good neighbor, the neighbor who resolutely respects himself and, because he does so, respects the rights of others. It was a beautiful sentiment, but would these words translate into actual change, or were they just empty rhetoric? The first real test came quickly. At the Montevideo Convention in December of 1933, the United States signed on to an agreement that included a revolutionary article. No state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another. For a nation that had built its regional power on the principle of intervention, this was a stunning reversal, and the actions that followed seemed to prove the commitment was real. In 1934, United States Marines withdrew from Haiti after a 19-year occupation. That same year, Washington abrogated the Platt Amendment, a treaty that had given the United States the legal right to intervene in Cuba for over 3 decades. The big stick was being put away. But was this really about respecting the rights of others, or was it about securing the hemisphere for a new, more dangerous era? The policy's critics, then and now, point to its inconsistencies. While the United States stopped sending in the Marines, it continued to wield enormous economic and political influence. Washington often cultivated and supported strongmen and dictators, as long as they were anti-communist and friendly to American interests. The infamous, though perhaps apocryphal, line attributed to Roosevelt about Nicaragua's dictator, Anastasio Somoza, "He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch," captures the cynical pragmatism that often lay beneath the surface of neighborly rhetoric. So, was the United States simply trading overt military force for a more subtle and perhaps more effective form of control? As World War II erupted, the strategic brilliance of the good neighbor policy became undeniable. Instead of a collection of resentful nations vulnerable to Axis influence, the United States found itself with a hemisphere of allies. By 1942, every single Latin American nation had severed diplomatic ties with the Axis powers, and most would eventually declare war. The policy had succeeded in creating a unified front that was crucial to the Allied victory. But what would happen to this spirit of cooperation once that common enemy was gone? The legacy of the good neighbor policy is therefore deeply complex. It marked a genuine and significant departure from the overt imperialism of the preceding era. It renounced military intervention and, for a time, fostered a level of mutual respect not seen before. Yet, it was also a strategy born of necessity, driven by economic desperation and the looming threat of global war. It did not end American influence, but rather changed the tools of that influence. So we are left with the central question: was the good neighbor a temporary, pragmatic strategy for a world in crisis? Or was it a permanent shift in the American soul? The decades that followed, with the Cold War and a return to covert intervention, suggest a complicated answer. It remains a fascinating pivot in history, a moment when a great power publicly chose cooperation over coercion, leaving us to wonder if such a choice can ever be permanent. The Monroe Doctrine. You probably think you know what it is. A declaration from 1823 telling European powers to stay out of the Americas. But that is only the beginning of the story. Its original meaning was twisted and reborn during the Cold War, and this transformation would change the fate of an entire hemisphere. For over a century, the doctrine was a statement against foreign monarchies and empires. But after the Second World War, the old empires were crumbling, and a new, more insidious threat, at least in the eyes of Washington, was spreading across the globe: Soviet communism. And the United States government began to wonder, how could they adapt a 19th century policy to fight a 20th century ideological war? The answer began to take shape with the Truman Doctrine in 1947. This new policy committed the United States to containing the spread of communism anywhere in the world. Suddenly, the Monroe Doctrine was not just about foreign armies landing on American shores. It was about foreign ideologies taking root in the minds of its neighbors. The first true test of this repurposed doctrine would come not in Europe, but in the lush farmlands of Central America. In 1954, Guatemala was led by a democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. He initiated a series of land reforms to redistribute unused agricultural land to peasant families. The problem was, the largest landowner in Guatemala was an American corporation, the United Fruit Company. Washington, heavily influenced by corporate lobbyists, framed Arbenz's populist reforms as a gateway to communism, a Soviet foothold in the Western Hemisphere. So the Central Intelligence Agency orchestrated a coup, codenamed Operation Be a Success, that violently overthrew Arbenz' government. This established a terrifying new precedent. The Monroe Doctrine could now be used to topple a sovereign elected government, not for what it had done, but for what Washington feared it might become. But if Guatemala was a test, Cuba was the ultimate confrontation. When Fidel Castro took power in 1959 and later aligned with the Soviet Union, it was a direct challenge to American dominance in the region. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was a clumsy first response, but the real crisis came in October of 1962. Soviet nuclear missiles were being installed just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. This was the absolute nightmare scenario, the ultimate violation of the Monroe Doctrine spirit. President John F. Kennedy, in his address to the nation, did not need to stretch the definition. He explicitly invoked its principles to justify a naval quarantine around the island. The old doctrine, designed to prevent colonial incursions, was now the justification for a standoff that brought the world to the very edge of nuclear annihilation. To legitimize these actions, the United States leaned on new agreements like the 1947 Rio Treaty, which called for mutual defense in the Americas. The Organization of American States was often used to provide a veneer of multilateral support for United States interventions. But was this truly a partnership of equals? Or was the Organization of American States simply a tool to rubber-stamp decisions already made in Washington, D.C.? This pattern continued for decades. The invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965. The covert support for the coup against Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. The funding of the Contra rebels in Nicaragua during the 1980s. In each case, the rationale was the same. A left-leaning government was portrayed as a potential Soviet proxy, and under the Cold War version of the Monroe Doctrine, that made it an unacceptable threat that had to be neutralized. And so, a doctrine born from a fear of European monarchies became a weapon in an ideological global struggle. It was transformed from a shield for new republics into a justification for intervention, coups, and proxy wars throughout Latin America. This Cold War rebirth left a complex and often bloody legacy, creating deep-seated resentment and instability that continues to echo in the relationship between the United States and its southern neighbors. It forces us to ask a difficult question. In repurposing the doctrine to fight a new enemy, did the United States truly protect the hemisphere, or did it simply create a new set of conflicts for a new century? Was the Monroe Doctrine freedom's shield, or empire's first brick? To understand one of the most defining and controversial principles of American foreign policy, we must travel back in time. The year is 1823. The world is in flux. Across Latin America, new republics were being born from the ashes of Spanish and Portuguese empires, but old European powers were watching hungrily, considering a return. So how could a young, relatively weak United States possibly hope to hold them at bay? On December 2nd of that year, President James Monroe delivered his 7th annual address to Congress. Buried within this routine speech were a few paragraphs that would echo for centuries a policy that would come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. It was deceptively simple, resting on two pillars. First, that the American continents were no longer open to future colonization by any European powers. Second, that the United States would view any attempt by those powers to interfere in the Western Hemisphere as a threat to its own peace and safety. It was a bold, audacious declaration, but it raised a critical question that everyone from London to Madrid was asking. Did the United States actually have the military power to enforce it? The truth is, in 1823, they did not. The real muscle behind the doctrine in its early years was the formidable navy of Great Britain, which had its own economic reasons for keeping other European powers out of the Americas. This raises an uncomfortable thought. Was America's grand statement of principle actually just a convenient alignment with a much greater empire's interests? For decades, the doctrine remained more of a statement of aspiration than a practical policy. The United States was focused inward on its own westward expansion under the banner of manifest destiny. But this expansion, particularly the Mexican-American War, seemed to contradict the anti-colonial spirit of the doctrine itself. How could the United States condemn European colonialism while engaging in its own territorial acquisition at the expense of a fellow American republic? The first major test came in the 1860s, when France installed a puppet Emperor Maximilian in Mexico. With the United States consumed by its own brutal civil war, it could do little but protest diplomatically. But once the Union was preserved, Washington's tone changed dramatically, and the press, the doctrine, it seemed, was finally growing teeth. But what would happen when those teeth were no longer used for defense, but for something else entirely? The turn of the 20th century brought a pivotal transformation. Under the assertive leadership of President Theodore Roosevelt, the doctrine was not just enforced, it was radically reinterpreted. In his 1904 corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt declared that chronic wrongdoing in a Latin American nation could force the United States to exercise an international police power. Suddenly, the doctrine was no longer a shield to protect Latin American nations from European intervention. It had become a sword, a justification for United States intervention in the internal affairs of its southern neighbors. What had changed so drastically to warrant such a fundamental shift in policy? This Roosevelt corollary ushered in an era of American military intervention across the Caribbean and Central America, a period often called the Banana Wars. The United States managed customs houses, rewrote constitutions, and propped up friendly regimes from Panama to Haiti, all in the name of stability. While Franklin Delano Roosevelt's good neighbor policy in the 1930s signaled a retreat from this heavy-handed interventionism, the underlying principle never fully vanished. The arrival of the Cold War gave it new life, reframing it as a struggle against foreign communist influence. Actions in Guatemala in 1954, Cuba in the early 60s, and Chile in 1973 were all in some way justified by this long-standing claim to hemispheric authority. But has this 200-year-old policy finally reached its end? In 2013, then Secretary of State John Kerry declared that the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. Yet, the legacy of intervention, mistrust, and economic dominance it created continues to cast a long shadow over relations in the Americas today. So, was it freedom's shield or empire's first brick? The historical record suggests it was, in a complex and often contradictory way, both. It began as a defiant stand for a hemisphere of independent republics, but it evolved, through interpretation and application, into a rationale for a new kind of empire, one whose influence is still debated and felt across the hemisphere to this very day.